Okay, welcome back. This is video number 2 of our trilogy, talking about a rational person's way of thinking through and navigating all the issues around climate change and the policies that are tied or associated with dealing with climate change. And on this second video, we're going to talk a little bit about what the elites and the expert classes are forcing upon society and economies when it comes to the cures or the medicines to help us deal or cope with climate change. And when you look at the consequences of the medicine or the cures that are being implemented, those consequences are significantly worse and will have materially worse consequences for economies and quality of life of citizens all across this globe than the actual symptoms or ailment of climate change, whether they're real or whether they're manufactured or imagined. So let's sort of go through the different ways and count the ways that the negative consequences will accrue with respect to many of the popular sort of features of climate policies these days. I'm going to start with the basic premise of why these policies are needed, which is the carbon dioxide emissions that would accrue from following through on net zero plans tied largely to things like wind and solar and electric vehicles in the transportation sector or industry. All three of those different forms of energy or transport, they carry substantial carbon footprints and carbon dioxide emissions. And it really goes back and ties to just a simple development chain, each step in the supply chain that you need to follow through on to have a solar panel or a wind turbine or electric vehicle either transport you a mile in the case of the latter, or to generate a kilowatt hour of electricity in the case of the former. So let's think through what needs to happen. First and foremost, you need to move and mine a tremendous amount of stuff, and I mean tremendous. And all of that mining and movement of surface area to get to the ore, so to speak, of materials that will be needed, that's going to require a substantial amount of carbon-fueled energy, transportation, equipment, etc. to get accomplished. And most of that, by the way, will happen in faraway lands, far from sort of the shores or borders of North America or Europe. Secondly, once you've mined the stuff, you need to concentrate that stuff into purified feedstock components. And that processing is going to require even more carbon energy to achieve. And again, most of that will occur in foreign or offshore locations. Then once it's concentrated, all those feedstocks, they come together in a manufacturing facility to start building the components for wind turbines and solar panels and electric vehicle batteries. Again, those factories most typically are going to be powered by carbon-based energy, in many instances coal-fired electricity and coal-fired power. Then all those components need to be transported to places like the United States and Europe, where we're going to install those solar panels and wind turbines. So whether it's ships, rail, trucks, planes to get all of those things here. Again, what's going to fuel all of that transportation? Typically carbon-based energy. Then once here, you've got to construct the wind turbine towers and the solar panel farms. You're going to need to use concrete, clear trees for pads, clear right-of-ways, transportation and transmission lines for the kilowatt hours, which are going to be made of metals. All of those things, again, carrying substantial and significant carbon footprints. And then, once everything's installed, you've either got to charge the electric vehicle to be able to run, which is going to inevitably use some form of carbon-based electricity, or if the wind doesn't blow and the sun isn't shining, which is often the case in places like Pennsylvania, then you're going to need a backup or a plan B for wind and solar, which again will typically be some form of carbon-based power or electricity. You add all that up, that's once again a very substantial carbon dioxide footprint, much higher than what you see for natural gas fire generation, much higher than what you find for nuclear power generation, and probably in the case of electric vehicles, if you do a legitimate accounting of the CO2 footprints on a life cycle basis, probably electric vehicles having a materially higher CO2 footprint life cycle-wise than even the internal combustion engine or gasoline-powered car. So that's perhaps the foundation of why the consequences will not be positive ones with pursuing sort of the medicine or the cures that have been prescribed. But there are many others. When you start thinking about the cost impacts, Wind and solar are not cheap when you're trying to have that be the foundation of your electric grid. We're starting to see signs of that across Western economies as we speak. Most of those examples are with respect to offshore and onshore wind projects, which are falling left and right because of failed economics and inflation that is basically driving the cost of those projects higher and higher. But you're also seeing it with general inflation. It's no coincidence that general inflation is raging all across the planet these days, and at about the same time, all of the large economies and societies have started to embark on these net zero type policies tied to tackling climate change. Again, far from a coincidence, one causes the other. If you increase the cost of energy and you create scarcity with respect to energy and you reduce the reliability of energy, that is going to touch basically the cost of everything else in society because everything utilizes energy. Thus, inflation starts to rage, and that's exactly what we're seeing. Now, none of this is going to be good news for consumers or for the middle class or for business owners or businesses themselves. And those are headwinds that are going to have also a whole host of negative consequences. Balance of trade, by the way, is going to suffer for the EU and for places like the United States because places like China or nations like China, they have already achieved, built, constructed a stranglehold on the supply chains for all of those steps that we just went through with regard to what it takes to manufacture an electric vehicle or a wind turbine or a solar farm. Then there's the geopolitical sort of component to this. And just looking around the world today, a dash to wind and solar and EVs without thinking things through and without running some simple math, it is going to enable a bunch of bad actors across the map. Bad actors like Russia, because they feel that they will have energy leverage over places like Europe. Now, how did that happen? Well, again, Europe pursued these net zero policies. They purposely, consciously shut down their domestic energy sources like natural gas and nuclear. They then made a mad dash to the arms of wind and solar. They have failed to deliver to anything close to what was hoped for. Something needs to fill that energy imbalance, and what was filling it increasingly was things like Russian natural gas through pipelines. Putin understood that. Russia saw that as a strategic lever, and they felt emboldened to do things like invade Ukraine not once, but twice. We've seen it with China. Again, leverage that has been sort of gifted to them through our policies in the West. They control those supply chains when it comes to wind, solar, and EVs. And now, as they're eyeing up and sort of sizing up Taiwan, don't think for a minute that energy policies aren't making them more confident with respect to what they might do aggressively versus less confident. And then we see it with places like Iran. It's no coincidence that these energy sort of volatility and energy chaos with regard to availability and pricing has reared their heads. At the same time, climate policies have been embarked upon that increased the price of things like oil, that sort of resurrected OPEC. If you look at the private sector within places like the United States with the shale revolution, it slayed OPEC, put it to bed once and for all. But then the energy transition and the climate alarmist movement through its policies, it's resurrected OPEC. And an entity like Iran reaps the benefits of that through its balance of trade. It then uses that funding to fund entities like Hamas. On top of it, we need Iranian oil to flow. We need Middle Eastern oil to flow to try to keep the price of oil down in the short term because of our own policies. So we make all kinds of concessions to Iran and remove sanctions and pallets of cash and that whole debacle, again, providing more funding to places like Hamas. And then we see what Hamas does when given the chance. And now we're seeing even Venezuela sort of catching on to what's going on with its newfound energy leverage it's been gifted it, where it is looking at its nearby neighbor Guyana, and it sees a gigantic oil reserve there and says, that's the future. We think we want that for Venezuela. And they're already starting to beat the drums of war now in South America. So we know geopolitically this is a disaster too. But the biggest negative consequence that I see out there is without a doubt what's going to happen to individuals living in the developing world that currently don't have access to reliable, affordable energy. Now, life for those individuals today, it's not pleasant. It's very harsh. It's brutal. And the sooner they get access to reliable, affordable energy, the better for them in ways that we can only begin to imagine. And net zero plans, the climate alarmist crowd, the code red crowd, that way of thinking, that is ensuring that the time that those individuals, and their billions in their numbers, get to reliable, affordable energy is going to be pushed out indefinitely into the future. What gives us, or our experts, or our elites, the moral authority to think that we've got the right to do that? So just some consequences to walk through there. When you add them all up, it's pretty clear we're on the wrong path when it comes to energy policies and climate policies. Now, what's really strange about this, if you start staying with and sticking with and following through on the medical analogy, this would be like us having some sort of ailment and going to the doctor. And the doctor tells us, all right, I know what's ailing you. I've got the cure. Here's what we're going to do. We're not going to use any modern pharmaceuticals, no modern drugs, no modern technology with medical imaging. We're not going to use any state-of-the-art surgical techniques. We're going to let go of all of those. In fact, we're going to ban those. We're going to outlaw those. And instead what we're going to do is we're going to put you on the table over there, and we're going to attach dozens of leeches to your body to drain the disease from your bloodstream, just like we did 200 years ago. Now, if a doctor did that, they would lose their medical license, and they would have to be hiring a whole team of defense attorneys to get ready for tort litigation, and rightfully so. But when our elites and experts prescribe basically the same giant leap backward to the obsolete, to the inferior when it comes to energy and climate policies, we all follow along like it's the sagest advice we've ever heard, which again is ridiculous. This is a giant regression backward to what's already been proven to be obsolete and inefficient and a less superior option or experience. Electric vehicles have been around for a long time, almost 100 years. There's a reason why economies, consumers, and societies moved away from them toward the internal combustion engine. The internal combustion engine vehicle is a superior product and a superior experience for a whole host of reasons. We've had windmills in this world for even longer. And again, we've moved away from them for very good reasons. The grid has advanced to the point where wind power, wind electricity, wind-generated electricity is obsolete and inefficient and inferior. Now, we know all this is ridiculous because the preachers, the experts out there that shout the loudest about the need for these poor climate policies and energy policies, they refuse to practice what they preach themselves. You see a huge degree of hypocrisy out there. Why is that? Because they don't want their quality of life to be harmed or eroded any more than we do. So that's why you see the United Nations Secretary General, who holds these confabs year after year in all these exotic locales where tens of thousands of attendees show up for a meeting, and cumulatively the carbon dioxide footprint of that confab is enormous. That's why you see our self-proclaimed climate czar, or unelected climate czar, I might add, who, when giving speeches, going from location to location or conference to conference, travels via charter jet. That's why you see a Hollywood movie star who fancies himself quite the geopolitical and ecological warrior, right, and making movies about climate change. You see him going to and from different ports on a giant carbon dioxide spewing yacht. They know what the math tells us, which is these prescriptions, these medicines, these cures are just the opposite. So I hope you enjoyed video number 2 of the trilogy. On video number 3 coming up, what you got to look forward to there is a discussion about what's really driving many of these climate policies that we see increasingly being hoisted upon societies and economies across the planet.